History often remembers kings for the wars they wage, but Catherine of Aragon waged a quieter, deeper battle for her marriage, her daughter, and her soul. The cold wind howled across the harbor as the ship dropped anchor off the English coast. Wrapped tightly in heavy garments against the biting chill, Catherine of Aragon stepped onto unfamiliar soil, her heart a tumult of hope, resolve, and quiet apprehension. Still barely more than a girl, she carried a weight far beyond her years. The hopes of a powerful alliance between Spain and England rested on her narrow shoulders. Her eyes, sharp and thoughtful, scanned the mist-shrouded shoreline of the land she would now call home. Each step she took marked the beginning of a journey toward a destiny that would demand unwavering duty, painful sacrifice, and unimaginable sorrow. Catherine of Aragon's story is far more than that of a queen. It is the story of a woman who embodied strength, endurance, and dignity in the face of relentless trials. Her life, from a cherished Spanish infanta to a queen cast aside, became a symbol of moral resilience and quiet defiance. Though centuries have passed, her presence still lingers in English history, not solely because she was Henry VIII's first wife, but because she represented a world soon to be shattered by political upheaval and religious revolution. Her refusal to yield to injustice would ripple through the English Reformation, altering the monarchy, the church, and the conscience of a nation. Too often, history reduces Catherine to her failed quest for a male heir. Yet her true legacy lies elsewhere, in her brilliant mind, her unshakable faith, and her steadfast commitment to the crown she wore. She showed moral courage in defying a king, a court, and an empire, all in the name of truth and honor. Her life reminds us that true power lies not in conquest, but in the grace to endure. Among the queens of her age, few shine as brightly, or as lastingly, as Catherine of Aragon. Her indomitable spirit was forged from birth. Born in 1485 in the town of Alcalá de Henares, Catherine was the youngest daughter of two of Europe's most formidable rulers, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Their union had transformed Spain into a burgeoning global power. Under their rule, the Reconquista ended with the fall of Granada, and Spain began to ascend as a dominant force on the world stage. Catherine was raised in a court of ambition, discipline, and profound religious conviction, a crucible that shaped her into a force of nature. From the start, she was treated not merely as a daughter, but as a dynastic instrument. Her fate was to forge alliances and extend Spain's influence. Unlike many noblewomen of the time, Catherine's education was rigorous and expansive. She mastered the domestic arts expected of a queen, but also delved deeply into theology, philosophy, and law. She became fluent in Latin, studied under renowned humanist scholars, and was groomed for governance. Her education was not ornamental, it was her armor, and she would wield it masterfully. That education made her an eloquent speaker and a sharp legal thinker. When later faced with defending her marriage before ecclesiastical tribunals, she argued canon law with a command that left even learned scholars in awe. In the glittering but perilous world of court life, where charm and intellect were prized as highly as bloodline, Catherine more than held her own. Equally central to her character was her devout Catholic faith. In her parents' court, religion was not just a matter of personal piety, it was a pillar of national identity and policy. The Catholic monarchs saw themselves as defenders of Christendom, and Catherine inherited that mantle. From an early age, she was taught that faith was not only a personal virtue, but a public duty. This belief would sustain her, and at times, harden her, in the face of adversity. Her piety was sincere. She attended Mass daily, gave generously to the poor, and personally supported religious foundations. But beyond devotion, her faith gave her purpose. She believed that suffering in service of righteousness was not a misfortune, but a divine calling. This conviction became especially vital when Henry VIII sought to annul their marriage. To Catherine, marriage was a sacred covenant, not to be broken by political whim. Her refusal to concede was not stubbornness, it was the outgrowth of deep, principled belief. Her early life, was a mix of privilege and preparation. While other young nobles enjoyed a life of ease, Catherine was trained for queenship. She learned multiple languages, studied diplomacy, and was schooled in courtly nuance. Every part of her upbringing aimed at shaping her into a queen not just in title, but in spirit. At 15, she was married to Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne. The union, a political cornerstone for England and Spain, was Catherine's first major step into destiny. Her journey to England must have been filled with anticipation and trepidation, the promise of honor shadowed by the unknown. Her arrival was marked with grandeur, but the marriage itself was short and sorrowful. Arthur died within a year, leaving her a widow and a political question mark at just 16. Caught in a web of uncertain diplomacy, Catherine remained in England, her future suspended. During this time, her resilience began to shine. Refusing to return to Spain defeated, she chose to wait, quietly and determinedly. Eventually, she married Arthur's younger brother, Henry, who would ascend as Henry VIII. Their early years were marked by genuine affection, with Henry often showering her with admiration. Yet beneath the gilded surface, trouble brewed. As queen, Catherine proved herself worthy of every expectation. She championed the education of women, engaged deeply in charitable work, and governed with skill during Henry's absences. In 1513, during the Battle of Flodden, Catherine served as regent and rallied English forces to victory, a striking testament to her leadership and resolve. Despite her many public triumphs, Catherine's private world was increasingly marked by sorrow. Over the course of her marriage, she endured numerous pregnancies, most ending in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, survived infancy. In a society where producing a male heir was not only a dynastic imperative, but a measure of a queen's worth, this failure cast a long, painful shadow over her life. The pressure strained her marriage to the breaking point. Henry VIII, once a devoted husband, grew restless. His frustration turned to fixation, and his gaze eventually settled on Anne Boleyn, a clever and ambitious lady-in-waiting whose allure and political savvy matched Henry's hunger for legacy. In the years that followed, Catherine fought not just for her crown, but for the sanctity of her marriage, with a fierce tenacity and unwavering grace that earned her admiration from contemporaries and the respect of posterity. She refused to accept the annulment of her union with Henry, insisting, with clarity and conviction, that their marriage was valid before God. Her defiance became more than a personal stance, it became a political and spiritual flashpoint. Catherine's refusal to yield forced Henry to break with the Roman Catholic Church and declare himself supreme head of the Church of England. Thus, her moral stand helped ignite the English Reformation and reshape the nation's religious and political foundations. In the twilight of her life, Catherine was cast into exile, banished from court, and cruelly separated from her beloved daughter. Yet she remained resolute. Her letters from this period are filled not with bitterness, but with grace and conviction. She continued to sign them as Catherine the Queen, never relinquishing the title she believed was hers by right and by divine sanction. Even in isolation, she clung to her faith and her identity. Her final words, spoken on her deathbed, were a moving testament to her strength of spirit. She forgave Henry, prayed for Mary, and reaffirmed her devotion to God. Catherine of Aragon's story is not simply one of sorrow or betrayal. It is the story of endurance, of quiet strength forged in suffering, and of dignity preserved in the face of injustice. She wielded no armies and claimed no throne in her own name, yet her legacy left a deeper imprint than most who ruled with force. She became a symbol of loyalty, integrity, and moral courage in an age when ambition often triumphed over virtue. Catherine's influence lingers not just in history books, but in the very soul of the English nation, a lasting tribute to the quiet power of a woman who would not be broken. From the very beginning, Catherine's future had been shaped by more than just royal blood. It was shaped by the complex machinery of dynastic politics. As the daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, her marriage was never meant to be a romantic union. It was a diplomatic chess move. In the wake of the Wars of the Roses, England sought stability and international legitimacy, while Spain, newly unified after the fall of Granada, was rising as a formidable European power. An alliance between the two kingdoms offered strategic advantage to both. For Spain, England was a foothold against French aggression and a valuable economic partner. For the Tudor dynasty, an alliance with one of Christendom's most powerful Catholic monarchies lent prestige and permanence to their still fragile claim to the throne. The match between Catherine and Arthur, Prince of Wales, was negotiated with meticulous care by seasoned diplomats eager to secure peace and prosperity through marital ties. Catherine was a child when the marriage was arranged. From her earliest years, she was raised not just to be a bride, but a queen. Her education reflected her royal destiny. She studied Latin, theology, philosophy, and political theory. She learned to speak with wisdom, to counsel with discretion, and to rule with grace. Her lessons were not just academic, they were a preparation for power, rooted in the Renaissance ideal that a queen should be not just ornamental, but wise and virtuous, a partner to her king. Her journey to England in the autumn of 1501 was a grand undertaking, filled with both anticipation and adversity. At 16, she set sail across the Bay of Biscay, accompanied by a retinue worthy of her royal rank. Storms battered the fleet, delaying their arrival and scattering ships across the sea. The chill and damp of the English autumn stood in stark contrast to the warmth of her homeland. The voyage tested her physically and emotionally, but Catherine pressed on, her resolve unshaken. She understood that she was not simply traveling to meet her future husband. She was carrying the hopes of two kingdoms. When she finally arrived, the reception was magnificent. London greeted her with pageantry and celebration. Crowds filled the streets, eager to see the young woman destined to become their queen. Despite the unfamiliar customs and foreign tongue, Catherine carried herself with a quiet confidence that won hearts and admiration. The wedding of Catherine and Arthur took place on November 14, 1501, in the awe-inspiring grandeur of St. Paul's Cathedral. The ceremony was not merely a union of two young royals, but a symbolic joining of nations. Banners bearing the heraldry of both England and Spain lined the cathedral, which was richly adorned for the occasion. Catherine wore a gown embroidered with jewels and gold thread, her hair studded with gems. Arthur, only 15, looked every inch the prince, slender and solemn, with a boyish earnestness that touched those who witnessed the event. Their vows, spoken in Latin, echoed through the cathedral, sanctifying a bond meant to secure peace for generations. After the celebrations, the young couple departed for Ludlow Castle, where they were expected to begin their duties as Prince and Princess of Wales. Perched atop a hill and surrounded by the rugged beauty of the Welsh countryside, Ludlow was both royal residence and regional seat of power. But life there was anything but idyllic. The harsh winter, the unfamiliar environment, and the pressures of expectation all took a toll. Catherine, raised in the palaces of Spain, found Ludlow drafty and bleak. Arthur, never robust, grew increasingly ill. Within months of their arrival, tragedy struck. Arthur died, leaving Catherine a widow at 16, alone, grieving, and adrift in a foreign land. Despite the many challenges they faced, Catherine and Arthur strove to fulfill the roles assigned to them. They held court, issued proclamations, and received dignitaries, carefully cultivating an image of regal authority and marital unity. Catherine, raised in a world where duty was paramount, met the demands of her new life with quiet resolve. She understood that personal happiness was secondary to political necessity, and she embraced her position with the discipline instilled in her since childhood. Even at just 16, she showed remarkable composure and strength, embodying the virtues of patience, resilience, and unwavering faith. But beneath the ceremonial veneer, tragedy loomed. In the early months of 1502, Arthur fell dangerously ill. Contemporary reports suggest he was struck by a virulent illness, possibly the sweating sickness, a mysterious and often fatal contagion that swept periodically through Tudor England. Despite the efforts of physicians and the fervent prayers of those around him, Arthur's condition deteriorated rapidly. On April 2, 1502, only months after his marriage, the Prince of Wales died at Ludlow Castle. Catherine, not yet 17, was left a widow in a foreign land. Arthur's death shattered years of careful diplomacy and planning. For Catherine, the loss was devastating. Though their marriage had been brief, she had invested herself fully in her role as his wife. Now she was alone, grieving not only the loss of a husband, but the collapse of the future she had been trained for since childhood. Her position became perilous. With the political alliance between England and Spain suddenly uncertain, her fate hung in the balance. Would she remain in England or return to Spain? Would her marriage be remembered as a diplomatic failure, or could another solution be forged? In the midst of her sorrow, Catherine revealed a quiet strength. She maintained that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a claim that would later prove critical. This assertion preserved the possibility of a future marriage to Arthur's younger brother, Henry, thereby keeping the Anglo-Spanish alliance intact. It was a delicate balance of truth, faith, and politics, and Catherine understood the stakes. For now, though, she remained in limbo, a princess without a husband, navigating the fraught terrain of the Tudor court with little security and even less certainty. The experiences of these years shaped Catherine profoundly. From her arduous voyage to England and the grandeur of her wedding, to the harsh cold of Ludlow and the crushing grief of widowhood, each trial left its mark. The hopeful young bride who had crossed the sea with dreams of queenship was gone. In her place stood a woman tempered by loss and sustained by a deep sense of purpose and duty. Through it all, Catherine's commitment never wavered, not to her family, not to her destiny, and not to her faith. Her steadfastness during these dark years foreshadowed the queen she would one day become, dignified, devout, and unyielding in the face of adversity. The story of her betrothal to Arthur and the trials that followed marked only the beginning of a life that would come to exemplify strength through suffering. Arthur's untimely death dealt a blow to both the English and Spanish courts. Catherine's grief was genuine and profound, but she had little time for mourning. Political uncertainty engulfed her. The union that had symbolized peace and cooperation between nations was now void, and with it, her place in England became tenuous. Would she be sent back to Spain, widowed, without status, and a diplomatic afterthought? Or could a new marriage be arranged, perhaps to the boy who now stood next in line to the English throne? Complicating matters further was the issue of Catherine's dowry. A significant sum had been agreed upon as part of the marriage treaty, much of it unpaid at the time of Arthur's death. King Henry VII, ever the cautious financier, was reluctant to relinquish the alliance and the promised funds. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, cautious in the face of loss, hesitated to pay the remainder of the dowry without certainty that their daughter's future in England remained secure. Negotiations became increasingly strained. Catherine, still mourning, was caught in the middle. She became less a person than a pawn, her future debated in the cold language of politics. It was suggested she might marry Henry, Duke of York, Arthur's younger brother. Such a union could preserve the alliance, but under church law, a man could not marry his brother's widow without a papal dispensation. Though such a document could be procured, it would take time and subtle diplomacy. In the meantime, Catherine's circumstances deteriorated. No longer the celebrated Princess of Wales, she was moved to the modest and austere Durham House in London. Financial support from the English crown dwindled. She managed her household on a meager budget, often lacking funds even for essentials. Her Spanish attendants, once resplendent in silks, now lived humbly, their morale sinking with each passing month. Catherine had arrived in England as a royal bride destined to be queen. Now, she lived in quiet obscurity, her future uncertain, her resources stretched thin. These years tested Catherine in every possible way. She could have returned to Spain, to the safety of her parents' court, but she remained, partly due to political considerations, but also because of her own resolve. She still believed in her destiny. She endured the indignity and hardship with the same inner strength that would define her later reign. What she suffered during this time would leave emotional scars, but it also forged an unshakable spirit. Isolated from court, Catherine lived in a kind of suspended existence. Her Spanish attendants were her only real companions, and even they faced growing hardship. Her letters from this period reveal a woman leaning ever more on her faith, seeking solace in prayer and reflection. She came to believe that her suffering had meaning, that her endurance would serve a divine purpose. In the silent hours of uncertainty, Catherine of Aragon became more than a royal bride in waiting. She became a figure of quiet defiance, shaped not by triumph, but by trials. Catherine of Aragon underwent a profound transformation in the years following Arthur's death. The radiant, hopeful princess who had once arrived in England gradually gave way to a more reflective and solemn woman. Yet beneath the quiet composure, her resolve only deepened. No longer just a dynastic bride, Catherine began to see herself as someone with a purpose greater than politics, someone destined to endure hardship for a higher cause. That inner strength would prove vital in the trials that lay ahead. The negotiations over her future dragged on, mired in diplomatic delays. Ferdinand and Isabella, consumed by broader European ambitions, were often slow to act in her favor. Henry VII, ever cautious and strategic, hesitated to commit to any arrangement that did not serve England's best interests. While the power broker stalled, Catherine waited in limbo. Time, once her ally, now became her silent adversary. Her youth faded, and with it, the image of the bright young bride she had once been. Hopes flickered on occasion, particularly the idea of marrying Henry, Duke of York. Catherine welcomed the prospect, seeing it as a way to reclaim her original destiny. But court politics were unpredictable, and each shift brought fresh delays. The longer the stalemate lasted, the more precarious her situation became. Her household shrank, funds dwindled, and uncertainty became her constant companion. She learned patience not by choice, but by necessity, and discovered just how brutal the waiting game of dynastic politics could be. Through it all, Catherine maintained a dignity that impressed even those indifferent to her plight. Her composure, piety, and unwavering strength earned respect at court and laid the groundwork for the public admiration she would later enjoy as queen. Internally, she must have wrestled with despair, but outwardly she remained steadfast. Her letters home were restrained, carefully worded to avoid distressing her parents. She stretched what little she had, kept up appearances, and carried herself with the quiet pride of someone who still believed in her royal purpose. There were humiliations, too. She had to petition for money, endure delays in promised payments, and depend on the charity of others, an indignity for someone raised to rule. She faced slights and insults that might have broken a less determined spirit. But Catherine endured. Her faith did not falter. Her belief in her rightful place in England remained intact. These years were a crucible. The illusions of youth were stripped away, replaced by a sober understanding of politics, power, and survival. Yet Catherine did not grow bitter. Instead, suffering forged a quiet moral strength, an inner fortitude that would become her defining trait as queen. At Durham House, she lived a life of quiet endurance. Day after day, she waited in uncertainty, training herself to remain calm in the face of chaos. Whether her future lay in a crown or in exile, she intended to meet it with grace. This long, uncertain period reshaped her. It hardened her resolve, deepened her faith, and refined her character. Catherine's widowhood did not erase her. Rather, it prepared her. She emerged from it scarred but steeled, her ambitions purified, her spirit sharpened. By the time a new marriage was arranged, she was no longer the innocent girl who had crossed the sea. She was a woman tempered by sorrow and armed with patience, a woman ready to reclaim her place at the heart of English power. Catherine of Aragon's regency was tested most dramatically during the autumn of 1513, when England faced the threat of invasion. As Henry VIII pursued glory on the battlefields of France, James IV of Scotland, honoring the Old Alliance, crossed the border, and brought war to the north. In Henry's absence, Catherine stood as England's regent, and in this moment of crisis, she rose to meet the challenge with extraordinary resolve. Far from serving as a mere figurehead, Catherine actively mobilized the kingdom's defenses. She coordinated military preparations, dispatched orders with urgency, and took personal responsibility for the safety of the realm. Her leadership extended beyond the administrative. She addressed the troops with a rousing speech that invoked patriotism and religious duty, reminding them they fought not just for land and crown, but for faith, country, and a king who had entrusted her with his kingdom. Her presence, commanding even from a distance, lent the campaign a sense of legitimacy and moral clarity. The Battle of Flodden, fought on September 9, 1513, was one of the most decisive English victories of the age. Led by Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, the English forces decimated the Scottish army. James IV himself fell in battle, a staggering blow to Scottish ambitions. In a bold gesture both symbolic and political, Catherine sent Henry a piece of the slain king's blood-stained coat. It was more than a trophy. It was a declaration of her competence, her authority, and her guardianship of English sovereignty in his absence. Catherine's regency did not end with Flodden. She remained deeply engaged in the political life of the court, deftly navigating factional rivalries and preserving stability in a volatile environment. She asserted her authority without alienating the powerful male advisors around her, maintaining a careful balance that protected both her influence and the image of royal unity. Her ability to steer court politics while respecting tradition ensured her position remained unassailable. Her political vision extended beyond England's borders. Catherine remained a steadfast advocate for an enduring Anglo-Spanish alliance. Motivated by both loyalty to her father, Ferdinand II of Aragon, and a strategic understanding of European geopolitics, she worked to ensure England remained aligned with Spain against the growing threat of French dominance. She consistently pressed Henry to strengthen ties with her nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, believing that a united front would secure peace and prosperity for both realms. Even as court factions favored alternate allegiances, most notably with France, Catherine remained unwavering. Her advocacy reflected a profound understanding of diplomacy and long-term strategy. She was not merely acting out of familial loyalty, she was acting as a stateswoman, positioning England within the wider currents of continental power. Catherine's political contributions were not limited to foreign alliances or wartime leadership. She was a champion of justice and reform at home. Her deep piety and strong moral compass drove her to support initiatives aimed at alleviating poverty, promoting education, and defending the rights of marginalized groups, including her fellow Spaniards in England. Her charitable works were acts of personal faith, but also of public service, strengthening her image as a compassionate and righteous queen. Religion remained central to Catherine's public identity. Her devotion to the Church, her support for religious institutions, and her veneration of the Virgin Mary were not only personal convictions, they were political tools. In a kingdom where spiritual authority underpinned social order, Catherine's piety became a cornerstone of her legitimacy. She used it wisely, reinforcing both the sanctity of the monarchy and her own position within it. But as the years wore on, the strength of her position began to falter. The failure to produce a male heir cast a long shadow over her marriage. Despite multiple pregnancies and the birth of a surviving daughter, Mary, in 1516, Catherine could not give Henry the son he so desperately desired. The pressures of dynastic succession intensified, and with them, tensions within the royal marriage. Catherine bore these trials with her characteristic endurance. Each miscarriage, each personal loss, was a private sorrow borne with public grace. She interpreted her suffering as a test of faith and remained committed to her role as queen and consort. But Henry's growing desperation led him to question the validity of their marriage, setting the stage for the great upheaval that would follow. The emergence of Anne Boleyn changed everything. Unlike Henry's earlier mistresses, Anne demanded more than favor. She demanded a crown. Henry, captivated by her intelligence and charm, sought an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. Thus began the long and bitter ordeal known as the King's Great Matter. Catherine responded with dignity and defiance. She refused to step aside, asserting the legitimacy of her marriage and her daughter's right to the throne. Her resistance earned widespread support from the English people, who admired her piety and constancy, and from powerful figures within the church who saw her as a bulwark against arbitrary royal power. Her stand came at great personal cost. Separated from court, barred from seeing her daughter, and stripped of her title, Catherine endured a slow and cruel political exile. Yet she never renounced her claim. Her refusal to yield, her appeal to Rome, and her unwavering sense of justice helped spark a crisis that would ultimately lead to England's break with the Roman Catholic Church. Though she lost the battle for her marriage, Catherine's legacy as queen endured. She had proven herself a capable regent, a masterful politician, a loyal ally, and a devout Christian. Her reign redefined what it meant to be a queen consort, not a passive ornament of the throne, but an active guardian of the realm. In the end, Catherine of Aragon's life became a testament to the strength of conviction, the endurance of principle, and the quiet, commanding power of a woman who refused to be forgotten. Anne Boleyn's meteoric rise and tragic downfall illustrate the treacherous volatility of the Tudor court. Her marriage to Henry VIII and coronation as queen, once hailed as the dawn of a new era, quickly unraveled when she, too, failed to deliver a male heir. As the political and religious factions that had once championed her cause began to dissolve, and found herself increasingly isolated, the same forces that had propelled her to the throne turned against her. In 1536, she was arrested, tried, and executed on charges of adultery and treason, charges widely believed to have been manufactured to clear the path for Henry's next union. The entwined destinies of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn laid bare the brutal interplay of personal desire and political expediency in Tudor England. Both women, formidable in intellect and conviction, were caught in the shifting tides of dynastic ambition. Their rivalries, trials, and ultimate fates reveal a court where queens could command immense influence, yet remain fatally vulnerable to the king's will. Their stories are marked by ambition, resilience, loyalty, and betrayal, leaving behind legacies that would resonate far beyond their lifetimes. The marriage between Henry and Catherine, once grounded in mutual affection and shared political interests, began to deteriorate under the crushing weight of dynastic necessity. Henry's increasing desperation for a male heir grew more acute as Catherine suffered a series of miscarriages and infant losses. Though the birth of their daughter Mary in 1516 provided temporary hope, it did not satisfy Henry's determination to secure the Tudor line with a male successor. He began to interpret their misfortunes as divine punishment, seizing upon a passage in Leviticus that warned of childlessness for a man who marries his brother's widow. Despite their marriage being sanctioned by a papal dispensation, Henry now claimed that it had never been valid in the eyes of God. Thus began what would come to be known as the King's Great Matter, Henry's campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine. It was not merely a personal dispute, but a complex theological and legal conflict with profound national consequences. Henry initially pursued the annulment through ecclesiastical channels, hoping to gain papal approval quietly. Yet Catherine would not yield. She rejected the notion that her marriage was invalid, maintaining that her first union with Prince Arthur had never been consummated, and that her marriage to Henry had been legitimate, lawful, and sanctified by the Church. Catherine's defense of her marriage was rooted in more than personal pride. She believed she was upholding a sacred vow, defending her daughter's legitimacy, and preserving the moral and legal integrity of the monarchy. Her resistance posed a formidable obstacle to Henry's plans, and her determination turned a private dispute into an international impasse. The matter reached the Vatican, where Pope Clement VII faced a political conundrum. On one side was Henry, King of England. On the other, Catherine's nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who had recently sacked Rome and held the Pope in his thrall. Caught between these powerful rulers, Clement stalled, hoping to avoid alienating either side. But his indecision only deepened Henry's frustration. Meanwhile, public opinion in England remained largely favorable to Catherine. She was admired for her piety, dignity, and sense of justice. Many viewed her as a wronged queen, cast aside after decades of loyal service and personal sacrifice. Henry, increasingly impatient and emboldened by Anne Boleyn's growing influence, began to seek alternative solutions. The crisis reached its emotional peak in 1529, during the Legedin trial held at Blackfriars in London. There, Catherine made a dramatic and unforgettable appeal. Refusing to acknowledge the court's jurisdiction, she knelt before Henry and spoke with eloquence and quiet strength, recalling their years together and asserting her unwavering loyalty. Her speech was a powerful defense of her marriage, her crown, and her daughter's right to inherit. It moved many to tears, even the king himself. But her words, however stirring, could not stem the tide of change. The trial ended in a diplomatic stalemate when Cardinal Campeggio, under orders from Rome, suspended proceedings and returned the matter to the Pope. Henry, incensed by this delay and the Pope's indecisiveness, began to pursue a more radical path. If Rome would not dissolve his marriage, he would free himself from Rome altogether. This was the beginning of the English Reformation. Influential figures like Thomas Cranmer, a theologian with reformist leanings, provided the ideological foundation for Henry's next move. Cranmer argued that the king, not the Pope, held supreme authority within his own realm. This idea, revolutionary in its implications, gave Henry the justification he needed to sever ties with the papacy and declare himself head of the Church of England. With this break from Rome, Henry finally obtained the annulment he had so long sought and married Anne Boleyn. Yet Catherine remained defiant. She refused to accept the annulment or Anne's legitimacy. She continued to refer to herself as queen and insisted that Mary was the rightful heir to the throne. For her defiance, Catherine was isolated, moved from court, and separated from her daughter. Yet she endured these hardships with quiet strength and unyielding faith. Her resistance delayed Henry's plans for years and exposed the deep fissures in both the English court and the Catholic Church. The fallout was vast: the dissolution of the monasteries, the redistribution of church wealth, and decades of religious conflict that would ripple through the reigns of Henry's children. Catherine's role in these events was far from passive. She shaped the course of history through her convictions and her refusal to surrender. Her steadfastness forced the king to exhaust every avenue before choosing revolution. She stood not only for herself, but for the sanctity of marriage, the legitimacy of her daughter, and the rights of queens to speak in their own defense. In doing so, she became a symbol of moral courage and a touchstone for debates about justice, conscience, and power. Even in death, Catherine maintained her dignity. She died in 1536, still calling herself Queen of England. Her legacy endured in the hearts of her supporters and in the memory of a nation that had watched her endure betrayal with grace and tenacity. Her struggle reminds us that history is not only shaped by the kings who wield power, but by those who resist it, with faith, fortitude, and an unwavering sense of right. The turning point in Henry VIII's battle for control came in 1534 with the passage of the Act of Supremacy. By this audacious decree, the English king proclaimed himself the supreme head on earth of the Church of England, formally severing centuries of spiritual allegiance to the papacy. English religious life was no longer beholden to Rome. Instead, it now answered to the crown. With this legislative thunderclap, Henry achieved what years of petitions and diplomatic wrangling could not. He secured an annulment from Catherine of Aragon and ratified his marriage to Anne Boleyn through the newly empowered ecclesiastical courts under the leadership of Thomas Cranmer, the reform-minded Archbishop of Canterbury. But the king's personal resolution was the beginning of a national upheaval. What had begun as a dynastic dilemma exploded into a full-scale religious revolution. The English Reformation had arrived, its tremors reaching far beyond the court, reshaping theology, politics, and society for generations to come. Through it all, Catherine of Aragon remained a figure of unwavering defiance. Though pushed to the margins of power, she stood unshaken in her conviction that she was Henry's lawful wife and England's true queen. Neither Parliament's declarations nor Cranmer's judgments could compel her to recant. She refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen, and she rejected the title of Princess Dowager as a cruel insult to the legitimacy of her marriage. Her resistance was not loud or seditious. It was quiet, dignified, and implacable, the moral foil to Henry's increasingly authoritarian rule. The price of that defiance was steep. Catherine was banished from court and stripped of the privileges she once held. She was shuffled between cold and remote estates, often deprived of sufficient funds and cut off from the comforts befitting her station. Yet perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was her forced separation from her daughter, Mary. The bond between them was profound, and their parting inflicted wounds that never healed. Both mother and daughter were pressured to submit, to relinquish their titles and accept the new order. Both refused. Catherine's steadfastness became a symbol for many who looked on the sweeping changes with dread and unease. To a populace disoriented by the rupture with Rome, she represented a vanishing world, one rooted in familiar rituals, spiritual authority, and the ideal of marital fidelity. Even in her diminished state, she was revered as a living emblem of piety, constancy, and rightful monarchy. Within the confines of her makeshift exile, Catherine maintained a shadow court of loyal retainers and sympathetic onlookers. Her presence, though diminished in visibility, continued to exert quiet influence. Her correspondences from this time reveal a woman battered but not broken. Her writings were filled with sorrow, yet animated by grace and conviction. She continued to pray for Henry, believing he had been misled, and she bore her suffering as a form of spiritual martyrdom. Despite sporadic hopes of reconciliation, the political reality remained unyielding. Henry viewed Catherine not just as an inconvenient former wife, but as a direct threat to his authority and to the legitimacy of his new marriage and unborn heir. Her mere existence was a living challenge to the new orthodoxy of royal supremacy and ecclesiastical independence. By the time of her death in January 1536, Catherine had been effectively reduced to a state of genteel imprisonment. Her final months were marked by worsening health and increasing physical weakness. Still, she clung to her title and her identity, refusing to let suffering strip her of dignity. In her final letters, she reaffirmed her love for Henry and her devotion to her daughter. She died not defeated, but resolute, her body broken, her spirit intact. The public response to Catherine's death was swift and heartfelt. Among the English people, her passing stirred deep sorrow. Even those who had accepted the king's reforms recognized the grace with which she had borne her fate. Her death marked the end of an era, and perhaps the last vestige of a royal marriage shaped more by duty and faith than by ambition and political expediency. At court, however, the response was strikingly muted. Henry showed little visible grief. Preparations were already underway to celebrate the birth of Anne Boleyn's expected child, the hoped-for male heir who would finally justify the king's years of upheaval. But Catherine's legacy lingered like a shadow across the triumphal pageantry, a quiet reminder of what had been lost in the pursuit of power. Her story endures as one of remarkable personal conviction in the face of profound betrayal. Catherine of Aragon stood firm against overwhelming odds, not with armies or intrigue, but with moral courage and steadfast belief. Her resistance became a quiet, enduring act of defiance that echoed across the centuries. In a time when queens were expected to yield, she chose instead to remain, and to remind the world that even the most absolute power cannot easily extinguish the flame of conscience. Amid the seismic upheavals of England's religious and political transformation, Catherine of Aragon stood as a steadfast beacon of conviction. Though stripped of her title and exiled from courtly life, she refused to recognize the annulment of her marriage or the legitimacy of Henry's union with Anne Boleyn. Her unwavering defiance, rooted in personal faith and moral integrity, made her a powerful symbol of loyalty and piety to many who viewed the changes sweeping through England as a tragic betrayal of tradition and conscience. Catherine's refusal to yield resulted in her forcible removal from court and a heartbreaking separation from her daughter, Mary. Relocated to increasingly remote and austere residences, Catherine's surroundings bore little resemblance to the grandeur she had once known as queen. Yet, even as her material circumstances diminished, her resolve remained unshaken. She steadfastly rejected the title Princess Dowager, insisting instead on her rightful place as Henry's lawful wife and queen. Her unrelenting stance underscored both her personal dignity and her devotion to safeguarding her daughter's claim and legacy. The enforced estrangement from Mary was Catherine's most profound sorrow. Their bond was one of deep emotional and spiritual intimacy, and the pain of separation was both acute and enduring. Yet Catherine's refusal to compromise on legitimacy, on faith, on duty, became the defining hallmark of her final years. Her resistance stood as a personal act of protest that reverberated far beyond her secluded exile, etching her into the historical consciousness as a moral anchor in a time of rupture. Years of emotional strain, isolation, and declining health eventually took their toll. By the early 1530s, Catherine's physical condition had markedly deteriorated. Reports from the time depict a woman increasingly frail, worn down by the accumulated weight of betrayal and sorrow. Still, she clung to her faith with a quiet ferocity. Her Catholic devotion, always central to her identity, deepened further in these final years, providing her with spiritual strength amid the collapse of her world. Her faith offered not only solace but also purpose. To Catherine, her suffering was not in vain. It was a trial borne with dignity, a test of loyalty to God and conscience. Even as her body weakened, her inner resolve remained unbroken. She continued to present herself not as a discarded wife, but as a queen chosen by divine providence, a role she refused to relinquish. In the twilight of her life, Catherine composed several deeply moving letters. Her final correspondence to Mary stands out as both a tender expression of maternal love and a call to perseverance. She implored her daughter to remain firm in faith and true to her rightful claim, passing on the torch of conviction that had sustained her own spirit. Another letter, possibly addressed to Henry, has sparked historical speculation. If such a letter did exist, it may have been an attempt at reconciliation, or perhaps a final assertion of her enduring love and belief in the sanctity of their bond, even after years of estrangement. Catherine died on January 7, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle. Her death, quiet and somber, reflected the isolation of her later years, yet it reverberated far beyond the walls of her final residence. Across England, those who had never stopped revering her mourned deeply. To them, she remained their true queen, a figure of sorrow, yes, but also of profound moral strength. Henry VIII, by contrast, showed little public sign of grief. His court moved swiftly to anticipate the birth of Anne Boleyn's child, hopeful that a male heir would legitimize the new order he had forged. He did not attend Catherine's funeral, nor did he issue any formal tribute. His indifference only underscored the callousness with which she had been discarded and the ruthless political calculations that had defined her fall. Speculation lingered about the cause of Catherine's death. Some whispered of poison, attributing her demise to enemies who feared her symbolic power as a rallying point for Catholic loyalists. Though unproven, these rumors reflect the deep unease that her principled resistance continued to stir, even in death. Regardless of cause, her early death at age 50 was indisputably hastened by years of emotional suffering, deprivation, and solitude. Catherine's legacy endured long after her passing. In popular memory, she came to embody the ideal of queenship rooted not in power or splendor, but in integrity, endurance, and grace. Literature and drama have frequently cast her as the wronged queen, dignified, devout, and unwavering. Shakespeare's portrayal in Henry VIII immortalized her as a tragic heroine whose spiritual grandeur stood in contrast to the political turbulence around her. Perhaps her most enduring legacy lay in her daughter, Mary I. Catherine's fierce defense of Mary's legitimacy and her example of spiritual steadfastness left an indelible mark on the future queen. When Mary eventually claimed the throne, she did so armed with the conviction and resilience inherited from her mother. Catherine's influence was woven into the very fabric of Mary's reign, a reign marked by religious fervor and a deep sense of divine mission. Catherine also helped reshape the perception of queenship itself. Her story raised vital questions about the role of women in authority, the moral boundaries of power, and the tension between personal conscience and political necessity. Her life revealed the vulnerabilities and strength inherent in royal womanhood, challenging prevailing assumptions about female agency in a male-dominated court. To English Catholics, Catherine of Aragon became far more than a wronged queen. She emerged as a martyr-like figure, a living emblem of the faith that had been cast aside by royal decree. In the turbulent era of the English Reformation, when religious and political loyalties were tested and reshaped, Catherine's steadfastness served as a beacon for those who felt displaced or betrayed by the sudden turn away from Rome. Her quiet but resolute defiance of King Henry VIII's demands and her refusal to accept the annulment of her marriage were seen as acts of profound conscience. Through her suffering and principled resistance, she came to symbolize the high cost of spiritual integrity in a time of sweeping national upheaval. Catherine's position as the legitimate queen was not just a personal belief, it was a matter of deep moral and religious conviction. She insisted upon her status with unwavering determination, even as she was banished from court, separated from her daughter Mary, and forced to live out her remaining years in relative isolation. Despite these humiliations, Catherine never wavered in her claim, nor did she renounce her Catholic faith, even when doing so might have eased her suffering. Her perseverance became a rallying point for English Catholics who mourned not only the fate of a devout and noble queen but also the fracturing of their spiritual identity as the Church of England broke away from Rome. In this context, Catherine's life took on a deeper, almost sacred significance. Her calm dignity under pressure, her refusal to denounce her marriage, and her enduring love for her daughter painted a portrait of a woman rooted in unwavering moral clarity. Her pain and alienation were not simply personal tragedies, they reflected the spiritual rupture of a nation and the human cost of a monarch's desire to reshape both church and state in his own image. To those who resisted these changes, Catherine was a moral compass, a reminder that loyalty to conscience often demands great sacrifice. Catherine of Aragon's legacy, therefore, is not defined merely by the political drama that surrounded her marriage to Henry VIII. It is defined by the strength of her character, her endurance, her principles, and her unshakable faith. She bore betrayal, exile, and heartbreak with a grace that outlasted the ambitions of her rivals and the shifting tides of history. Even centuries later, she is remembered not only for what she endured, but for how she endured it, with honor, piety, and a deep sense of justice. In remembering Catherine, we are reminded that true strength is not always loud or forceful. Sometimes, it resides in the quiet, resolute defense of one's deepest convictions, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Catherine of Aragon remains a timeless symbol of dignity, resilience, and the enduring power of faith in a broken world.